All right, so today's lesson we're going to focus on adding some event handlers and also, having our text boxes like last time, entering some input, but have a little checkbox that says I agree to the terms. And when you do that, it actually enables the submit button. So if I disable the checkbox, the submit button doesn't work, right? But if I check the checkbox and I click on submit, we're going to have a little alert box pop up. It's a little JavaScript alert box. So we're learning how to do JavaScripting, mixing JavaScripting with C#. So it's easy to do with HTML, but it's a bit challenging to do with C#. So we're learning how to do that today. So learn how to mix C# and JavaScript. The other thing we're going to learn, so we'll be learning how to tie in an event handler into a checkbox. And the next thing we'll learn is look at the dropdown and have a list of different images. So like another logo, for example. So we're going to tie an event handler here so it updates the image over there and also load other images. And these images are actually animated GIFs, so don't worry about the animation when you see them. And so that's our goal for today. This is where we learn how to build. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is open up Visual Studio, of course. So I'm going to take this away. And we're going to say File and New Website. And we'll say ASP.NET empty website. And we'll give it a home. So just navigate to the folder you want to create a project in. And it'll ask you if the folder doesn't exist, so would you like to create the folder? Go ahead and do so. And just hit OK. All right, so in our solution, we basically have just the web.config. So the first thing we're going to do is bring our images into the solution. So we can actually create our folders here as well and add new files. So first thing we're going to do is I'm going to right click on week 8b and say add and new folder. And I'm going to call this folder images. And the next step for us is to actually copy the images we've downloaded off the internet and place them into the images folder. Right? So whatever images we're going to use, we should copy them into this images folder. So what's convenient is that I could right click on the images folder, and this can apply to any file as well. And I could say open folder in File Explorer. And so when I do that, it loads Windows Explorer, which is empty. But now I can navigate to my downloads folder and copy and paste the files into here. So that's what we're going to do right now. So I'm going to find my files. So I'm going to copy my files over. So I want this image, I want this image, this image, and this image. Copy, Control-C, Control-V to paste. And I have my images here. All right, so I'll close that off, move that back. And I can hit the refresh over here in the top to refresh and see my images here. All right, so now that we have our images in place, let's add a home page to put our code into. So I'm going to right click and say add new item. And what I want is a web form. So I have to scroll down near the bottom for a web form. Oh, here it is. Fourth one down. So, Visual C# web form. And like I said earlier, the index.html that we have in typical HTML is actually now known as default.aspx here. So we'll leave it as default.aspx. That'll be our home page. And next to it is the checkbox. I'll make sure that place code in separate file is checked so that we can have that separate CS file to work with. And so we'll hit add. All right. And we have our HTML code. All right. So now it's up to us to add our ASP code to this HTML here. So it's auto-generated a lot of the stuff for us. So I'm going to switch to design mode and start by adding in our labels and text boxes. So I'll start with a label that'll just say username. So I have my label there. I'm going to use the properties window and change the word label to username and the ID to LBL user. All right, so that'll be my label for username. The next thing I'll add is a text box next to it for that username. And I'll leave it as single line, so text mode will be single line. The text will be empty. Just call the text TB user. Maybe stretch it out a bit. I'm going to do the same thing for password. So I'm going to actually put my cursor at the end of the text box, hit enter, so it'll automatically insert my break line, and do the same thing again. And so the text for this second will be password. And the ID will be LBL pass. And drag a text box next to it. And this text mode, I'll switch to password. And I'll scroll up, and the ID will be TB pass. All right, so add a few enters below it to add some extra space down there. Now, we'll start by adding our checkbox and a submit button. So first thing I'll do is add a little checkbox. And the text for the checkbox will be, I agree to the terms. And we'll call this checkbox CB terms. And below it, I'm going to add a button for submitting. And this button will be submit. And the ID will be BTN submit. Now, one other thing we're going to do with the submit button is I don't want it. So there's two ways to handle disabling this button. One is to go to visible and set it to false to make it invisible, but I don't want to do that. I just want to disable the button. So if I go to the enabled property and switch that to false by default, it will disabled a button. So you see the button, but you just can't do anything with it. And then what I want to do is I want to be able to create an event handler so that when I check the checkbox, we'll enable the button. And if the checkbox is ever unchecked, we'll disable the button. So if I ever want to create an event handler for a checkbox, I can just click on the checkbox, but then double click it. When I double click on the checkbox in my CS file, so under default.aspx, if I expand it, there's default.aspx.cs, so it's tied together. There's cb terms underscore check changed. So this event handler fires whenever I change the state of the checkbox from checked to unchecked and vice versa. So what I'm going to do here in this case is I'm going to check to see if the checkbox is clicked. If it is, we'll enable the submit button. Otherwise, we'll disable a submit button. So inside here, we'll say if cb terms.checked. So the check property is what checks to see if it's been checked off or not. It's equal to true. Then we'll say that btn submit.enabled is true. Otherwise, or else, btn submit.enabled is false. Now we could try running this. So I'll say view in browser. We'll see if this, check to see if this works. So if I bring this over and I check it off, it doesn't do anything. It's still not working, right? And that's because we have, what we talked about earlier in the lecture portion was that there's this term called auto postback that allows us to refresh or go back to the server upon doing this sort of action, and we need that here. So I'm just going to close this off, and we'll switch back to default.aspx, highlighting the checkbox. Let's look for auto postback under the properties, and we'll set that to true. Now by setting that to true, you should be able to run it and see your checkbox working. So if I check off the checkbox, now we have a submit button that doesn't really do anything, but it's enabled. So that enable auto postback, that property needs to be enabled to do stuff. All right, so now that we got the checkbox working, let's look at the submit button. I want to create an event handler for submit, and I want to add some JavaScript code to get the alert box to appear. So I'm going to double click on submit, and it'll auto-generate the btn submit click event handler for me. Right? And in this event handler, what I want to do is I just want to have an alert box pop up. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my JavaScript code in a string. So the first thing I'm going to do is declare a string. So I'm going to say string myJS is equal to var answer equals alert. Just put thank you in single quotes. So that's going to be my JavaScript code. So once I have my JavaScript code, and the nice thing is you can actually append like variables like thank you and username, for example. You know, you can do whatever you want. We're just using a simple string. Just use simple string manipulation. The next thing now is to get that JavaScript code to execute. So there's an object called client script. And there's a few methods. One in particular we're going to use is called register startup script. So I'm going to type right below it client script dot register startup script. Right? There's a number of overloaded versions of this. I'm going to use one that it takes in 4 arguments. I'm going to put these arguments on separate lines just for readability's sake. So the first argument is basically is this.getType. All right. So the type of object I'm going to apply this script to. The second argument is I'm going to give a name to this particular script that I am going to execute. I'm going to call this script myAlert. So in double quotes, I'm going to say myAlert. The third argument is the script itself. So we called it my.js. And finally, the last argument is true. And let's see why. All right. So there's a final argument called add script tags. So we're adding a tag to this script. That's what's going on there. So essentially, this method call will allow us to execute any JavaScript code we want. So now you can actually try running this. So view in browser. And I hit I agree to the terms. That enables my submit button. I hit submit, and the thank you alert box comes up. All right, so now that we've got the JavaScript working, our next step is to go back to default.aspx. Let's get an image to appear. So I'm going to drag an image. And when I drag that image, I'll leave the image as image1, the default name. But there's a property called image URL. If I click on it, there's 3 dots. And so if I click on the little ... button, I can navigate to images, and I can find the image. I'm just going to use, that's it. And actually not height. I want to do the width as 600 pixels. That's better. All right, so now I'm going to view this in browser. And so this comes out much nicer. So I just want to constrain my image width to 600 pixels so it views nicely here on the screen. All right, so what I do is I want to bring over a drop-down so that I can have a chooser to choose different images. So I think what I'll do is I'll put some text here to say, choose a graphic to display. Right? I'm not going to use a label there. I'll just type in the text directly. And then I'll bring over a drop-down. So a drop-down list. Now the thing about the drop-down list is that it's used in a lot of places. And what happens is that when we expand the arrow, we have a choice for choose data source or edit items. Now, if I want to link this to, say, a database table, then I'll choose data source. And I'll go through these steps to connect it to a database, like a SQL Server database, for example. And then from there, I will have the items automatically updated from the database. We'll do this in a couple of weeks, so we're not going to touch this right now. What we're going to do is hard code the items. So I'm going to stretch this out a bit. And I'll go back here and choose edit items. And so when I choose edit items, I'm going to physically hard code all of the items. So what I want to do first is I want to add an empty one, just to show how we can add an empty one. I'm not going to touch it. I'm just going to let it be list item. Well, I won't touch any of the properties for this first list item. And what it'll do is it'll display a blank for me. So you have the ability to add like blank items as well, like a default blank. I'm going to hit add one more time so I can actually add my first item. And so my first item will just be my logo. So I'm going to put the word logo as text. If I hit tab, it automatically tries to fill the value with logo. So we'll see how we'll see the significance of value in a moment when we play with the C# code side of things. So we'll have text. This is the text will be what's displayed, and logo will be the value that we're trying to select. All right. I'm going to add two more, so I'll add another one here, and this one will be. I have a loading screen, so depending on the images you download, you'll give names according to that. Right. So I actually have two loading images that I'm going to display. The first, as well as my logo. So I have loading, I'm going to call it loading 1. I'm just going to let the value be the same, loading 1. And then I have another one, I'm going to call it loading 2. Right, so loading 1, loading 2, and logo. Those will be my images. What I care about is remembering the values. So I have value as logo, I have loading 1 as logo, or as a value, and I have loading 2 as a value as well. So these are the values I'm going to work with. And so when I'm done, I'll just hit OK, and it'll have my items. So let's see what that looks like in the browser. So I'm going to say View in Browser again. And if I hit my drop-down, I see all of my items. So logo, loading 1, loading 2. Looks a little thin, so I'm going to thicken that a bit. But I have all my items hard-coded. So what I want to do now is I want to attach an event handler to it so that it updates this image every time. So I'm just going to stretch that a bit for readability's sake. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an event handler. So I'm going to double click on the drop down here. It's going to create a method called dropdown list1 underscore selected index changed. So I didn't change the name, so I kept it as the default dropdown list1, and it's creating an event handler called selected index change, meaning every time I change the dropdown, then it will change the value for me. So what I want to do is I want to check to see what was selected and then change the image value accordingly. So my image is called image1, right? That's the default name that was given. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first retrieve the item. So I'm going to say string choice equals dropdown list1 dot selected. Now before I finish this off, there's a few selected items here. There's selected index, which is 0 to n minus 1. So I can choose, was it item 0, was it item 1, was it item 2, and so on. That may have some benefits, maybe to a hard-coded approach like what we're doing right now. The other item is there's selected value. So selected value is probably the most common one we're going to use because we care about the value that was entered. And in a database scenario, we would care about the selected value there as well. So 90% of the time, we're going to be using selected value. Right? So I want that value that we hard-coded. Now that value is an object, so I'm going to convert it to a string. All right, so I have my choice here, and it's going to be either, for me, it's going to be either logo, loading 1, or loading 2, or blank. All right, so I'm going to put an if statement up. So I'm going to say if choice equals logo, then I'll say image1 dot image URL is equal to, and then I'll just put the location of the image and the file name. So I want to load the file logos square dot JPEG. So I want to load logo square dot JPEG, right? So I'm going to say tilde slash images slash logo square dot JPEG. And I'll say else if choice equals loading 1. So that was my other value. Then I'll say image1 dot image URL equals tilde slash images slash loading. So I'm going to choose the one at the top. So this one's called loading monkey.gif. And then I'll say else if choice equals loading 2, then again image1.image URL is equal to / images / this one's called loading monkey small, and there's a bit more to it, so I'm going to fill in the rest of the name, nobg.gif. Okay, so I have my file names there. And then I'll just put in else, just to load the original image. So else image1 dot image URL equals / images / logo4.png. So that'll be my entire event handler. And what it'll do is it'll check to see what was chosen from the dropdown, and based on the selected value, it'll load a different image. All right, so let's run this and see if it actually works. So I'm gonna go view in browser. And if I choose something from my dropdown, it doesn't work. Right? It doesn't work. And it's for the same reason as the checkbox that enable postback. So we have to enable that. So I just need to switch back to default.aspx. Now I can do this in 2 places. By highlighting the combo box, I can go to the top and choose auto postback into true. Or the nice thing about the combo box and the drop down is that enable auto postback, the checkbox is right here. So I can choose that, it automatically change my property to true as well. And so now if I run it, all right, now I'm going to choose logo, change the image, right? So loaded my entire image, and then change to loading 1, and that's an animated GIF, so it's already animating for me, and loading 2, right? So that's another animated GIF as well. If I want to revert back to the original, there, I have my original logo. So what did we cover today? We learned how to add event handlers to checkboxes and to dropdowns. We learned about postback and how it actually is significant in getting event handlers to work. We learned about how to add a JavaScript code to C#. We learned to play with images. So we did a lot of different things inside this exercise here.